Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1046 just came out, and this was a real okay chapter. I think I can speak for everybody when I say that my personal favorite part was the final page of seeing Luffy looking like a thunder god or something like that in the sky, grabbing a bolt of lightning, seemingly ready to hurl it down at Kaido. I never imagined that Luffy would be fighting like this, seemingly bending reality to his will in some ways. Because no matter what, I don't think any of us had this concept in mind when we were thinking of what's Luffy's Gear 5th going to look like, what's Luffy's awakening going to look like. And I think those were my favorite parts of the chapter, getting those little, cuts back to what's going on with Luffy versus Kaido, right? Big surprise, yeah, I'm sure that for most people those are your favorite parts of the chapter. So I do like the fact that at the beginning, we had a bit of a pause in the battle between Luffy and Kaido. I think that pause was kind of needed just to slow things down, get some interactions between them, and kind of flesh out, okay, what's happening right now? How do both characters feel about this? What's Kaido thinking? I really, really like the juxtaposition that we got between what Zunisha is saying versus what Luffy is saying. And I'm interested to see how this is addressed going forward, because Zunisha is saying, oh, this feels so familiar, right? I know exactly what this is. This is basically, it's like the modern day Joy Boy. This reminds me of exactly, like, this is the new Joy Boy essentially for the modern era. And Luffy, on the other hand, is basically saying, who am I? Well, I'm Luffy. I'm the man who's going to become the Pirate King, right? So he's very confidently saying something as though it's something, I guess you could say, this is me, I'm my own person, this is what my goal is, my story, versus Zunisha, who's basically talking as though, oh, this is replaying out an old story, and he's the hero that was supposed to return in some sense, right? So the idea that Luffy is playing out, this is something that has been at the forefront of community discussion for a while, but the idea that Luffy is sort of playing out, a predetermined fate, as Zunisha seems to suggest, versus the idea that this really is Luffy carving his own path and deciding what he wants to do, as Luffy himself sort of seems to be proudly proclaiming. And obviously that might be reading a little bit too much into that, little juxtaposition, but it's interesting to see where it goes, because as we know, identity, important theme of this arc, fate, destiny, those are becoming very, very, very important in the story right now as to, what really is Luffy's story, what is the role that he's playing, how much of it is him, how much of it is fate. And I get the sense that it's, from everything we're seeing, it's a bit of a mix of those two things. And I'm not going to expand on that too much into this video, but on the one hand, it's like, okay, is it just this huge destined thing that Luffy ended up eating the Gomu Gomu no Mi, not the Gomu Gomu no Mi, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika? Or is it also just the fact that, Luffy himself, intrinsically as a person, just happens to have these traits that lend himself very well to being that natural successor to Joy Boy in the modern age, and that is why the fruit of its own free will, Zoan fruits having their own free will, ended up choosing him. So there's a discussion to be had there. There's no need to rehash any of that right now, because it feels like the story is going to address it. I think the way that it was framed, this chapter does suggest that we are going to reach a point where this idea of destiny versus free will is going to be addressed in the story, and I think that is very important if you've been following my recent videos. So I really like that opening interaction, and also just the fact that Kaido, Kaido he's a straight shooter. He's not upset or anything like that about what's happening. He's interested. He thinks it's cool that Luffy's gotten his awakening. I think it's very funny that from what Kaido said to Luffy, like, I've lost my men, I've lost my castle, I've lost everything, but so have you, right? Like, does Kaido think he's been killing people this war? Like, what's he talking about? Does he think that that Luffy's side has lost people? Does he think that he killed Kinemon? I don't know what Kaido's talking about there, because as far as I can tell, it's like, no, I think most of the losses are pretty much just on this side of things, and I think the other, the other squad's pretty intact as far as I can tell. So don't know what Kaido's thinking there, but I just thought that was kind of funny. So beyond the Luffy Kaido stuff, and beyond, I guess, the Destiny, Fate, Free Will stuff, the Raizo sections of this chapter, yeah, I guess the reason I said that this is an okay chapter is largely because it focused on the fire and everything like that, and I think maybe a lot of people are just like, yeah, naturally, had to address the fire at some point. My only thing is basically the reason I didn't love this chapter is not just because it was about Raizo, even though I think out of all the Scabbards, Raizo is personally, for me, one of the ones that I care the least about. I think that he is one of the ones that we did get the least focus on. That's largely because his introduction was essentially the reveal that he's been this guy that they've been protecting for a long time, but we didn't actually get that many moments throughout Zou or Wano to really flesh him out as a character, even as much as something like Inuarashi or Nekomamushi, right, in my opinion. So partly it's focused on Raizo, so it's not particularly interesting, but I will say flip side is that I actually did find Raizo versus Fukurokuju by the end of it to have been an interesting battle to have going on in the background of other battles, just because the way that fight heated up till eventually Raizo's spirit, overcame essentially Fukurokuju's. I think that was a good reflection as to what was going on in the bigger fights, on the other floors. So I actually did enjoy that part of it. The reason I didn't care for this that much, the fire situation, is partly because the fire, I think this was the first chapter that you can really say that like everybody was actually, that the fire was treated with serious, like as though it was finally becoming a true life or death situation. Yes, you've had plenty of characters talking about the fire for so long, everyone's been pointing out that there's a fire. Once in a while, characters are like, oh, these flames are getting pretty hot. Like, oh, if we don't solve this fire soon, it's gonna get pretty bad. Oh man, the fire. It's like it's been building, and there's been rumblings and murmurs and like worries and everything about the fire. Everybody's been talking about it. But this was the first chapter that it was kind of really played up. Like, okay, the fire is now really, really bad. We're all gonna die. We're all gonna get cooked if the fire is not solved. And then the fire was solved basically 5 pages later, a few pages later. So it was kind of that, which is that the idea of the fires essentially was basically just a long-running problem in the side for a long time, and then finally when it became an overbearing problem, right, it was immediately resolved. So it wasn't something that really lasted, there was no tension from it that really lasted any decent amount of time. And also partly that's affected by the fact that even though this chapter was the first time that the fire was actually treated with, some serious life or death consequences, Oda was cutting between every character to address the fire, right? Pretty much each little scene that he cut between, it was also punctuated with some sort of gag moment or comedy moment, basically. So also each time he's cutting between characters being like really worried about the fire, but also punctuating it with a gag, so it never really felt like a big deal, and then it was kind of just checked off by the end of the chapter. And I know you might say, well, it's One Piece, so it's always gonna have gags and stuff like that, but I'm saying in the context of what the fire was kind of set up to be over the course of this arc. So like, if you compare it to the Buster, like go back and rereading the Buster Call situation towards the end of Enies Lobby, or the Birdcage towards the end of Dressrosa, those were impending sort of calamities that were threatening everybody, that were treated with extreme seriousness for several chapters, as though they were life or death situations for several chapters in a row. And you could find an occasional gag here or there regarding those, like, in Buster, maybe you can find a panel of Usopp running his nails on chalkboard in a background or something like that. Or, there's a funny panel of that grandmother getting up and running during Dressrosa during the Birdcage as she found energy from King Riku's speech. But I'm saying, like, those were 99% serious situations played out over multiple chapters to really build the tension. Whereas the fire here, it felt like it was in the background for a long time. Finally, people are kind of treating it seriously, but Oda's also doing gags across the board for every character's little fire acknowledgement scene. And then it's resolved basically pretty quickly afterwards with Raizo's jutsu. So that's my take on the fire. I'm putting it in, in the context of like, okay, if this was the sort of impending calamity around the protagonists, as we've seen in many other situations before, I think that the fire just doesn't really hold up in that sense to any of the usual situations that we see the Straw Hats, their alliance, etc., put into towards the end of the arc. So that's my take on it. Beyond that, I will say flip side is that I do think it was really good that Raizo was the one who ended up resolving it, because as much as I don't personally care too much about Raizo, it makes sense in the context that we know that Raizo essentially, up till now, he's had this sort of burden of having been this character that so many people, so many minks had to essentially put their lives on the line for and were tortured, limbs were lost, we don't know how many people died, but their entire civilization was devastated, right? So Raizo has to live with the guilt of that, and he's responsible for that. Obviously not personally responsible for that, but it's very unfortunate and it's just unfortunate for him that he was inadvertently the cause of so much pain, suffering, destruction, right? So out of all of the Scabbards, I think it made the most sense that he would have a moment where he gets to kind of pay that back. And when everybody else is, you know, their lives, their heads are on the chopping board, they're about to die, they're about to get burned to death, Raizo's the one who's able to reverse that, basically save everybody. And I guess it's not like he needed redemption, because it's not his fault that his friends, the Minks, wanted to protect him so badly that they underwent unimaginable suffering for days and days for him. It's not his fault, but it also feels right that at the end of the day, the fact that, you know, they put so much on the line to protect Raizo, that ended up meaning something and actually changing the final segments of this battle, right? He was ultimately the key to saving all of them, so, you know, some kindness right here basically gets repaid in full when it really matters. And I think that was a really good idea by Oda to make sure that Raizo gets a moment like that beyond just beating Fukurokuju, who doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to care about Raizo that much. So I like the idea, I like what happened for his character. Don't care about the character that much, and definitely never really cared about the fire that much. And honestly, this chapter, when it was kind of building up the fire, didn't, you know, the dramatic tension just being cut over and over again regarding the fire and then being resolved pretty quickly. I personally didn't care for the whole fire plot line. So, besides all that, the chapter ends with Yamato Momonosuke, right? Yamato Momonosuke is finally going to hold up the Onigashima Island from falling. I was beginning to wonder if this was going to happen, because, you know, Momonosuke, he'd come up to watch Luffy versus Kaido duke it out. I was beginning to wonder, okay, are we actually going to get Onigashima falling and Momonosuke having to save it, because he seems to have dropped the flame cloud situation. It makes sense, because I guess Momonosuke had to be distracted for a little bit so that he's no longer pulling back the flame cloud so that Onigashima can travel over the flower capital. So that did have to happen over a couple chapters. That did have to happen. So now I wonder if we're going to cut to next chapter seeing Onigashima directly above the flower capital, and then, you know, Momonosuke getting his scene. Because I have been looking forward to this scene for some time, because Momonosuke's character is easily the most developed character. You know, he's the character that's had, really the only character that has had a focused character arc from the start to finish of Wano. So I'm looking forward to this next scene for his character. I do think that how Yamato plays into this, or if she plays into this at all, will be interesting. And I have a video on Yamato, I think, coming next week, so I'm interested to see the reactions to that. But I think this is a potentially very important scene for her to finally get something. But, you know, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. Either way, looking forward to that. I wouldn't be surprised if Oda kind of juxtaposes Momo getting his moment with Hiyori getting her moment downstairs. That would be probably really good. And I think lastly, what I did not talk about is the Blackbeard pirates potentially showing up at Whole Cake Island. Now, we have, I think ever since Blackbeard had that little, honestly even before that, but definitely ever since chapter 956, when we saw Blackbeard talking about, like, okay, if the world government's not going to go for it, then I'm going to go for it. I think many people have been like, okay, Blackbeard pirates going to Whole Cake Island makes sense. With these mysterious figures showing up, I definitely think it is the Blackbeard pirates. I might drop a theory video on that next week, maybe either Tuesday or Friday. I've got to figure out the order of videos, basically. But I think I have a somewhat crazy but fun theory on that, which, I don't know, I'm looking forward to sharing. So that's all for this video, and if you enjoyed, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe.